In the autumn of 1883, deep in the Wyoming Territory near the Wind River Range, a Norwegian immigrant named Lars Eriksson became the subject of considerable mockery among his fellow homesteaders. The man had arrived 2 years prior with little more than an axe, a determined spirit, and ideas about shelter that struck his neighbours as nothing short of lunacy. While established settlers like Thomas Wardell and the Hutchinson brothers lived in proper square cabins with 4 walls and peaked roofs, Lars had begun constructing something that looked to most eyes like a child's attempt at building with sticks. A triangular frame, they said, narrow as a coffin stood on end, barely wide enough for a man to lie down inside. The nearest neighbour, Wardell, lived about 3 miles east as the crow flies, close enough to visit on horseback, but far enough that each homestead felt the profound isolation that came with frontier life. When word spread about what Lars was building, men rode over just to see the spectacle for themselves, and they left, shaking their heads, certain the Norwegian would freeze to death come winter. Lars Eriksson had worked as a carpenter's apprentice back in Christiania before crossing the Atlantic. Though he'd never finished his training, he came to Wyoming Territory with his younger brother Henrik, hoping to claim land and build a life far from the crowded cities of the old country. Henrik had taken sick during their first winter and died before spring thaw, leaving Lars alone on 160 acres of high prairie bordered by pine forest to the west. The land sat at considerable elevation, exposed to winds that could cut through wool and leather like they were nothing at all. Winter temperatures in that country could drop until breath froze in the air, until the moisture in a man's nostrils turned to ice with each inhale, until fingers went numb even through thick gloves after minutes of outdoor work. The homesteaders in the area had all built traditional log cabins, chinked with mud and moss, heated by stone fireplaces that consumed enormous quantities of wood. These cabins were solid structures, built the way folks had built them for generations. 4 walls of stacked logs forming a square or rectangle, a steep roof to shed snow, a single door, perhaps 1 or 2 small windows. But Lars had noticed something during that first brutal winter while Henrik lay dying. The square cabin they'd hastily erected leaked heat like a sieve. No matter how much wood Lars fed the fire, the far corners of the room remained bitterly cold. Snow would drift through gaps in the chinking. The wind seemed to find every crack and crevice, whistling through the structure with mocking persistence. Meanwhile, Lars had taken shelter during a hunting trip inside a natural rock formation, a narrow triangular crevice in a cliff face, and he'd been struck by how much warmer it felt, despite having no fire at all. The space was tight, barely room for him and his bedroll, but the cold seemed unable to penetrate it the way it invaded his cabin. He'd spent that night warmer than he'd been in weeks, and the observation lodged itself in his mind like a splinter. When he tried to explain this to Thomas Wardell and the others, they looked at him as though he'd lost his senses. A cabin was a cabin, they said. 4 walls, a roof, a hearth. That was how civilized people lived. Only savages and animals lived in holes and narrow spaces. The social cost of pursuing his idea weighed heavily on Lars. He was already an outsider, a foreigner with an accent that marked him as different. And now he was abandoning the proven methods of the community. Men stopped inviting him to barn raisings and communal work parties. When he rode into the small trading post at South Pass City for supplies, folks would nod politely but keep conversations brief. Even the widow Sarah Morrison, who had shown some kindness to him after Henrik's death, seemed uncertain about maintaining a friendship with a man the whole territory considered touched in the head. Lars himself lay awake some nights wondering if they were right, if grief and isolation had addled his thinking. But then he would remember that night in the rock crevice. Remember how the tight space seemed to hold warmth, in a way the cabin never did, and he would push the doubts aside. The technique seemed absurd because it violated every assumption people held about proper shelter. A cabin should be spacious, they believed. Room to move, room to store goods, room for a family. The idea of deliberately building something narrow and confining struck them as not just wrong, but perverse. A kind of self-imposed imprisonment. They couldn't see past the traditions they knew, couldn't imagine that sometimes less space might mean more warmth. By late September of 1883, Lars had made his decision. He would build his triangular shelter before the first serious snow. Testing his theory fully before committing to a larger version, he planned carefully, thinking through every detail based on what he'd observed in that rock crevice and in the natural world around him. He'd noticed how pine trees grew in dense clusters in the mountains, creating triangular spaces at their bases, where snow rarely penetrated and where deer would bed down during storms. He'd observed how the Shoshone would sometimes construct temporary shelters with sharply angled sides rather than vertical walls. The logic made sense to him in practical terms, though he couldn't have explained it in any scientific way. A triangular structure, narrow at the base and rising to a peak, would present less surface to the wind. The angled walls would shed snow more efficiently than any peaked roof on a square cabin. The tight space would require less heat to warm, meaning less wood consumption through the long winter months. He estimated he'd need perhaps 20 to 25 tall, straight pines. Maybe 30 if he wanted extra material for mistakes. The wood would need to be thick as a man's thigh at the base, strong enough to support considerable snow load. He chose lodgepole pine, the kind that grew arrow-straight in the mountain forests about a day's ride west of his claim, through October, as aspens turned gold and the first light snows dusted the high peaks. Lars worked alone in the forest. He would ride out before dawn, fell trees through the morning, strip branches and bark through the afternoon, then drag the logs back to his homestead using his 2 draft horses. The work was brutal, the kind that left his hands blistered and bleeding, his back screaming with pain by nightfall. He selected each log with care, looking for ones that were straight and true, free from rot or excessive knots. The wood had to be dry enough to work with, but not so dry it would split easily. He learned through trial and error, ruining several logs before he developed an eye for quality. The lodgepole pines were perfect in their way, evolved to grow in tight competition with their neighbours, reaching for sunlight with minimal taper from base to crown. By the time the first hard freeze arrived in early November, Lars had assembled his materials near his existing cabin, a collection of 30 logs ranging from 15 to 20 feet in length, each one stripped clean and notched at careful intervals along its length. The construction drew spectators like a circus coming to town. Thomas Wardell rode over with his 2 oldest sons, ostensibly to check if Lars needed help, but really to witness the folly firsthand. The Hutchinson brothers came, and old Samuel Briggs, and even some of the younger homesteaders who'd only heard about the crazy Norwegian through rumours. They watched as Lars began setting his structure, first driving thick foundation posts deep into the ground in a triangular pattern, each side perhaps 6 feet at the base, narrowing as they rose. Then he began laying the logs at sharp angles, creating walls that sloped inward dramatically, meeting at a point nearly 12 feet above the ground. The whole thing looked impossibly narrow, scarcely wider than a coffin at the base, barely room for a man to lie down. "That ain't a cabin," one of the Hutchinson brothers said, loud enough for Lars to hear. "That's a damn pine coffin stood on end. He's building his own grave marker." The men laughed, though not unkindly. They genuinely believed Lars was wasting precious time and materials on a structure that would prove useless when real cold arrived. Thomas Wardell, who considered himself something of a voice of reason in the community, tried once more to talk sense into the Norwegian. "Lars, winter's nearly here. You've got a cabin already. Why waste good timber on this? Even if it keeps out wind, where you going to put your stores? Where you going to live like a human being?" Lars had looked up from his work, wiped sweat from his forehead despite the cold air, and said simply, "I live warm. That is human." The work continued through November into early December. Lars fitted each log with meticulous care, overlapping them like scales on a fish, creating walls nearly 2 feet thick at their base. He chinked the gaps not with mud, but with layers of dried grass and moss packed so tightly that no light showed through. The entrance was the trickiest part, a low opening facing east, away from the prevailing western winds, barely large enough for a man to crawl through. He fashioned a door from thick planks, double-layered with dried moss between them, hung on leather hinges treated with animal fat to keep them supple in the cold. Inside, he built a small fire pit, nothing like the large stone fireplace of a traditional cabin, just a circle of rocks to contain embers, with a narrow smoke hole rising through the peak of the structure. The entire project took him nearly 2 months of solitary labour, working through light snows and freezing temperatures, his hands becoming so accustomed to the cold that he could work bare-fingered for short stretches without losing feeling. When he finally completed the structure in mid-December, it stood like a strange monument on his land, a narrow pyramid of logs that looked to his neighbours like the world's most elaborate firewood pile. The ridicule had only intensified as the structure neared completion. Sarah Morrison had ridden past one day and stopped to stare, her face a mixture of concern and confusion. "Mr. Eriksson," she'd said carefully, "I know you've had a difficult time since your brother passed. If you need help, if you need to talk to someone, the pastor at South Pass makes his rounds." She'd meant it kindly, but Lars understood what she was really saying. She thought grief had broken his mind. The men at the trading post had started taking bets on how long Lars would last in his pine coffin before crawling back to his regular cabin. Some gave him a week. Others were less generous, suggesting he'd abandon the experiment after a single night. Only old Samuel Briggs, a veteran of winters in the Rockies going back to the fur trade days, had refrained from mockery. Known a few trappers who wintered in tight spaces. He'd said quietly to Lars one day, "Can't say I ever seen it built deliberate-like, but there might be something to it. Might be." It was the only encouragement Lars had received, and he'd held on to it during the loneliest moments of construction. The initial tests came during a cold snap in late December. Nothing severe by Wyoming Territory standards, but cold enough that breath misted heavy in the air, cold enough that water in buckets froze solid overnight, cold enough that men kept fires burning around the clock. Lars had moved a bedroll and some basic provisions into his triangular shelter, along with a modest supply of firewood. That first night, he built a small fire in the stone circle, just enough to create a bed of coals, nothing like the roaring blazes required to heat his square cabin. Within an hour, the narrow space had become warm enough that he'd removed his heavy coat, sitting in just his wool shirt and feeling comfortable for the first time in weeks. The heat from the small fire seemed to fill the space completely, with nowhere to escape, held in by the thick log walls and the tight dimensions. He ventured back to his cabin to check the temperature difference, and the contrast struck him immediately. Even with a substantial fire burning in the fireplace, the cabin's far corners remained bitterly cold, cold enough to see his breath, cold enough that frost formed on the interior walls near the floor. Back in the triangular shelter, warmth wrapped around him like a blanket, the air still and comfortable, no drafts cutting through despite the wind he could hear howling outside. Over the following weeks, Lars continued his observations, spending nights in both structures to compare them directly. In the triangular shelter, a single armload of firewood would last nearly all night, the coals maintaining gentle heat that the tight space amplified and held. In his cabin, he would burn through multiple armloads, trying to achieve even a fraction of that comfort, and still wake to frozen water buckets and frost patterns on the windows. The difference in firewood consumption was striking, a matter of direct experience rather than careful measurement. Where his cabin required constant feeding of the fire, constant work to maintain even marginal warmth, the shelter asked far less of him. He could sleep through the night without waking to tend the fire, trusting the design to hold whatever heat the coals produced. Some of his neighbours noticed he was riding to the woodlot less frequently, but they attributed it to him giving up on staying warm, assuming he was just enduring the cold rather than fighting it. When Thomas Wardell asked about it, Lars had tried to explain the efficiency, how the narrow space required less heat, how the angled walls seemed to direct warmth inward rather than letting it rise and escape. Wardell had nodded politely, but remained unconvinced. "Seems to me you're just cramped and cold and making the best of a bad situation," he'd said. "No shame in admitting a mistake, Lars. Come spring, you can build proper." The reason it worked made sense to Lars through simple observation and practical comparison, though he'd never have called it science. He'd noticed how when he wore layers of clothing, the warmth his body produced stayed trapped close to him. But when he wore just a single coat, that same heat seemed to vanish into the air around him. The triangular shelter worked the same way, he reasoned, like wearing layers. The thick log walls, packed with insulation, were the outer coat. The tight space was like a shirt close to the skin, holding heat near rather than letting it spread thin across a large area. He'd observed how a root cellar stayed cool in summer because the earth around it stayed a steady temperature, insulated from the sun's heat. His shelter worked in reverse, insulated from the cold, holding whatever warmth he created inside. The angled walls meant snow would slide off rather than accumulate and create weight that might crush a flat roof. The narrow entrance, low to the ground, meant cold air couldn't easily rush in the way it did through the door of his cabin. Every gust of wind that hit his cabin found cracks to penetrate. But the triangular shelter presented smooth, angled surfaces that deflected the wind around and over it, like water flowing around a boulder in a stream. He'd watched wind patterns across his land, seen how the snow drifted against his cabin's flat walls, creating barriers and pressure points, while his shelter seemed almost invisible to the same wind, shedding snow and deflecting gusts with its simple geometry. As January 1884 approached, old-timers in the territory began reading signs that made them uneasy. Samuel Briggs had lived through enough Rocky Mountain winters to recognize the warnings. The elk had come down from the high country earlier than usual, moving in large herds to the lowest valleys. The horses were growing thicker winter coats than normal, shaggy as bears. Birds had vanished weeks ahead of their usual migration, and the few that remained huddled silent in protected thickets. The light snowfalls of early winter had been deceptive. Briggs warned anyone who'd listen. The real cold was coming. The kind that arrived once every decade or so. The kind that killed cattle and broke the spirit of men who thought they'd seen everything winter could offer. The barometric pressure had been dropping steadily for days, and the sky to the northwest held a peculiar yellow-grey quality that veterans of the high country recognized as the harbinger of something serious. By the third week of January, everyone in the territory was laying in extra firewood, checking their livestock shelters, preparing for what the signs suggested was coming. Thomas Wardell had reinforced his barn and stacked firewood nearly to his cabin's eaves. The Hutchinsons had brought their cattle into a sheltered valley and built windbreaks from cut timber. Even the youngest homesteaders, the ones who'd only seen a few Wyoming winters, understood something unusual was bearing down on them. The storm arrived on January 24th, with a sudden temperature drop that felt like falling through ice into dark water. The morning had been cold but clear, cold enough that sound carried for miles, cold enough that snow crunched like broken glass underfoot. By noon, the temperature had plummeted further, a cold so intense it seemed to have physical weight, pressing down from a sky going grey, and then yellow, and then a queer greenish colour that old-timers said meant serious trouble. The wind began around 2 in the afternoon, not gradually building, but arriving all at once, like a wall of frozen air smashing across the high prairie. Within an hour, snow was falling so thick a man couldn't see his hand held at arm's length. The temperature continued dropping through the evening and into the night, falling to levels that made previous cold snaps seem mild by comparison. Cold enough to freeze spit before it hit the ground. Cold enough that exposed skin would freeze in minutes. Cold enough that men began to understand why the animals had fled and why Samuel Briggs had been warning them for weeks. This was the kind of cold that killed, that froze cattle standing in their shelters, that turned men's breath to ice crystals in their beards, that made survival itself uncertain for anyone unprepared or unlucky. Lars Ericsson crawled into his triangular shelter that evening with a modest supply of firewood, perhaps a dozen split logs, and sealed the low entrance behind him. Inside the narrow space, he built a small fire, just enough to establish a bed of coals, and settled into his bedroll as wind screamed outside with a sound like the world ending. The walls of the shelter creaked and groaned under the assault, but the design deflected the wind's force around and over the structure, shedding its violence like a ship's bow parting waves. The small fire filled the tight space with warmth that built gradually, held by the thick log walls and the tight dimensions, until Lars found himself comfortable in just his undershirt, warm enough to sleep without shivers, without the teeth-chattering cold that had marked every previous winter night. Outside, the temperature had dropped until breath would freeze solid, until metal became so cold it would tear skin from any flesh that touched it, until the very air seemed to crystallize. But inside the narrow triangular space, warmth accumulated and held, the geometry of the structure trapping heat, the way a cupped hand holds water. A quarter-mile away in his square cabin, Thomas Wardell was fighting a losing battle against the cold. He'd built his fire as large as the fireplace would hold, filling it with logs until flames roared up the chimney, consuming wood at a rate that would exhaust his supply within days if the cold persisted. But the heat from that massive fire seemed to vanish into the cabin's air, rising straight to the rafters and escaping through every gap and crack that Wardell had thought properly sealed. His wife and children huddled under every blanket they owned, pressed close to the fireplace. But still they shivered. Still they felt the cold creeping through the floorboards and leaking through the walls. Wardell himself kept his heavy coat on, added layers throughout the night, and still felt the cold working its way into his bones. He fed the fire constantly, hourly, burning through his carefully stacked wood supply with growing desperation. The corners of the cabin were so cold that water buckets froze solid despite being indoors. Frost formed on the interior walls, creeping up from the floor like some crystalline disease. The wind found every imperfection in the chinking, every gap between logs, creating drafts that made candles flicker and made the cold feel like living things stalking through the room. The situation was similar in homesteads across the territory. The Hutchinson brothers burned through 3 days' worth of firewood in a single night, taking turns to keep their fire fed, exhausting themselves in the effort. The widow Morrison huddled with her 2 young daughters in a corner near the fireplace, wrapped in every piece of fabric they owned, praying the cold wouldn't penetrate their last defences. Old Samuel Briggs, experienced and well-prepared, still found himself working constantly to maintain heat in his cabin, wondering if his wood supply would outlast the cold. This was the kind of cold that revealed the weaknesses in every structure, that tested the limits of human endurance and preparation. Square cabins that had seemed solid and warm during normal winters proved inadequate against this level of cold, their large spaces impossible to heat effectively, their flat walls and right angles creating perfect targets for wind and cold to exploit. The storm lasted 3 days and nights, though it felt like 3 weeks to those enduring it. The wind never stopped, the temperature never rose, the snow never ceased its horizontal assault. On the second day, when the worst of the wind had passed but the cold remained paralyzing, Thomas Wardell made a decision born of desperation. His wood supply was dangerously low. His family was suffering despite his best efforts, and he'd heard that Lars Ericsson was somehow surviving in that ridiculous triangular structure. Pride and skepticism warred with necessity, and necessity won. He bundled himself in every layer he owned, wrapped a scarf around his face until only his eyes showed, and made the journey through snow that reached his thighs, through cold that made breathing painful, across the 1/4 mile to Lars's homestead. He found the triangular shelter nearly invisible under its coating of ice and snow, just a narrow white pyramid rising from the drifts, and he called out Lars's name, with lungs that burned from the frozen air. When Lars crawled out through the low entrance, Wardell noticed immediately that the Norwegian wore only a single layer coat, no scarf, no extra wrappings. His face showed no sign of the brutal suffering Wardell and his family had endured for 2 days. "You all right, Thomas?" Lars asked, genuine concern in his voice. Wardell's response came in gasps, his words broken by shivers. "Lars, I need my family. We're burning through, can't keep warm enough, is there? Could we?" He couldn't quite bring himself to ask directly, to admit that he'd been wrong and Lars had been right. But Lars understood. "Come inside," he said simply. "Warm yourself." See, Wardell hesitated at the low entrance, the narrow opening that looked more like a burrow than a doorway. But the cold was a more powerful argument than pride. He crawled through on hands and knees, emerging into a space that struck him with its warmth like a physical blow. The contrast was so immediate, so dramatic, that for a moment he couldn't speak. After 2 days of unrelenting cold despite massive fires, after 2 days of watching his family suffer, despite burning through wood at an unsustainable rate, he found himself in a space barely larger than a grave that was warmer than his cabin had been on the mildest winter day. A small bed of coals glowed in the stone circle, just a handful of embers, producing heat that seemed impossible from such a modest source. Wardell stayed for nearly an hour, letting the warmth seep back into his bones, feeling sensation return to fingers and toes that had been numb for days. Lars explained the principle as he understood it, using comparisons Wardell could grasp. Like when you cup hands around a candle, Lars said. The flame is small, but your hands stay warm because the heat has nowhere to go. The cabin, it is like trying to warm a barn with that same candle. Too much space, heat rises and escapes. This. He gestured at the narrow walls close around them. This holds the heat close, like cupped hands. Wardell looked around the tight space, seeing how every element worked together. The thick walls packed with insulation, the angled surfaces that shed snow and deflected wind, the tight dimensions that required minimal heat to warm completely, the small entrance that prevented cold air from rushing in. The design that had seemed like madness now revealed itself as elegant efficiency, every choice made with purpose, every element contributing to a whole that worked better than traditional methods, despite violating every assumption Wardell had held about proper shelter. The firewood economy was undeniable. Lars had burned perhaps 6 small logs over 2 days, while Wardell had consumed what would normally last a week. The temperature difference was something Wardell could feel in his very bones. After hours of suffering had made way for simple comfort in a space most folks would consider too cramped to inhabit. When Wardell finally crawled back out into the brutal cold to return to his family, his mind was working through calculations. His voice, when he spoke, carried a humility that came from having absolute certainty proven absolutely wrong. I was a fool, Lars. I'm man enough to admit it. This storm's got maybe another day in it, maybe 2. When it breaks, I'm coming back. I'm bringing Timothy, and we're building one of these for my family. I'll pay you for the knowledge, for your time helping. Name your price. Lars shook his head. No payment needed, Thomas. You would have helped Henrik if you could have. This knowledge, it should be shared. A man shouldn't freeze for lack of knowing better. Wardell made his way back through the storm. The warmth he'd absorbed in Lars's shelter lasting only minutes once he was back in the killing cold. But the knowledge lasted considerably longer. His family survived the remaining days of the storm, though it required burning through nearly all their remaining wood. The temperature didn't truly break until the morning of the 4th day, when the wind finally died and the sun emerged into a sky so blue it hurt to look at it. In the weeks following the Great Freeze of January 1884, attitudes across the territory underwent a transformation as dramatic as the temperature had been. Thomas Wardell, true to his word, arrived at Lars's homestead 2 days after the storm broke, bringing his oldest son Timothy and a sincere request to learn. They spent a day examining Lars's shelter, discussing the principles behind its design, planning how to build one adjacent to Wardell's existing cabin as a supplementary winter space. Within a week, the Hutchinson brothers had ridden over, their pride swallowed by the memory of 3 nights spent in exhausting battle against cold in their traditional cabin. That storm like to killed us, the older Hutchinson admitted. Burned a month's worth of wood in 3 days, and still couldn't get warm. Whatever you got here, Lars, we need to learn it. Even families who'd lost livestock or suffered other hardships during the storm came seeking knowledge, understanding that the Norwegian immigrant they'd mocked had solved a problem they hadn't known they could solve. By the following autumn, 5 triangular shelters stood in the territory, each one a variation on Lars's original design, adapted to the specific needs and resources of different homesteaders. Some were larger. Some incorporated modifications like stone floors or double-layered walls. But all shared the fundamental geometry that Lars had discovered worked so effectively against Wyoming's brutal winters. The winter of 1884–1885 was milder than the previous year, but those who'd built the shelters found themselves living in previously unknown comfort, burning a fraction of the firewood their neighbours consumed, sleeping warm through nights that would have been miserable in traditional cabins. Sarah Morrison, who'd thought Lars mad, apologized to him at a community gathering that spring. "I judged wrong," she said simply. "You saw something the rest of us missed. Henrik would have been proud of you." The validation meant more to Lars than any apology for the mockery, because it acknowledged not just that he'd been right, but that his brother's death hadn't been meaningless, that the suffering of that first winter had led to knowledge that would spare others similar suffering. Lars Eriksson's original triangular shelter served him for nearly 15 years, through winters mild and harsh, its thick log walls weathering storms that destroyed other structures, its efficient design providing warmth and safety season after season. When Lars finally married Sarah Morrison in 1887, they built a larger dwelling together, combining traditional cabin design with elements of Lars's shelter, creating a hybrid structure that balanced space and efficiency. But the original shelter remained standing, used for storage and as a reminder of the winter when an idea dismissed as madness proved itself through the most severe test nature could provide. Lars lived to see his children grown, lived to become the old-timer who younger homesteaders consulted about surviving the high country, lived long enough to watch his triangular design become common knowledge in the territory. The shelter itself stood for nearly 25 years before winter, and weather finally brought it down in 1908, long after Lars and Sarah had moved to lower country, long after its lessons had been learned and integrated into the practical wisdom of those who called the Wind River country home. The story of Lars Eriksson and his triangular shelter reveals something essential about innovation and the nature of wisdom in any era. True progress often looks foolish to those invested in traditional ways, not because tradition is wrong, but because human beings naturally resist changing what has worked adequately, even when something might work better. Lars wasn't an engineer or a scientist. He was a carpenter's apprentice who'd learned to observe closely, to notice patterns in the natural world, to trust his experience over the collective certainty of the community. The rock crevice that sheltered him during a hunting trip, the clustered pines creating warm pockets at their bases, the way his own body stayed warmer in tight spaces than in open rooms. These observations cost him nothing but attention, yet they led to understanding that saved lives and reduced suffering across an entire territory. The men who mocked him weren't cruel or stupid. They were simply doing what humans do, trusting the accumulated wisdom of their culture, believing that if triangular shelters were better, someone would have built them already. They couldn't see that sometimes knowledge waits not for genius, but for someone willing to pay attention and act on what they observe, even when doing so invites ridicule. The frontier demanded practical solutions from people who often had nothing but their own intelligence and determination. There were no engineers to consult, no building codes to follow, no experts who could tell a homesteader the best way to survive in country that killed the unprepared. Settlers had to observe, adapt, experiment, and learn from their mistakes in real time, with their lives as the stakes. Lars Eriksson wasn't unique in this regard. just representative of thousands of men and women who solved impossible problems with the materials and knowledge they had. His willingness to endure social mockery, to persist despite isolation and doubt, to trust his observations over community consensus. These qualities built the frontier more surely than any tool or technique. The triangular shelter worked because Lars understood that survival sometimes requires abandoning what looks proper in favor of what actually functions. That efficiency matters more than conformity. That warmth and safety matter more than appearing civilized to neighbors who are themselves struggling. These stories of frontier innovation deserve more than academic interest or nostalgic appreciation. They represent human beings at their most resourceful, solving genuine problems through observation and determination, creating knowledge that saved lives. When we remember these stories, when we share them and discuss them and learn from them, we honor not just the techniques but the spirit that created them, the willingness to think differently, to trust experience over assumption, to persist despite mockery and doubt. If you found value in Lars Eriksson's story, if you felt connection to the struggle and triumph of a Norwegian carpenter who refused to freeze just because everyone said his idea was crazy, then help keep these memories alive. Subscribe to this channel so you won't miss other stories of frontier ingenuity that deserve remembering. Leave a like to show that practical wisdom from the past still resonates today. And most importantly, share your own stories in the comments, whether from your family history or from knowledge passed down in your community. These accounts of human resourcefulness form a collective heritage worth preserving. Proof that ordinary people solving everyday problems with courage and creativity have always been the true architects of progress. Each story we remember and share is a small act of respect for those who came before, who survived and thrived through intelligence and determination in circumstances we can barely imagine. The men and women of the American frontier weren't legends or myths. They were real people with real fears and real doubts, who got cold and tired and discouraged, who made mistakes and suffered setbacks, who sometimes felt like giving up. But they also had something we can learn from: a willingness to observe closely, think independently, and act on conviction even when everyone else said they were wrong. Lars Eriksson stood alone through months of mockery, because he trusted what he'd experienced in a rock crevice more than what his neighbors assumed about proper cabins. That kind of courage, that willingness to think differently in service of practical results, built more than shelters. It built communities, territories, and ultimately a nation. The triangular shelter that kept him warm through the brutal winter of 1884 was just logs and geometry, but the mind that conceived it, and the determination that built it despite ridicule, those were the real innovations, the real legacy worth remembering and honoring.